Hello there, thanks for tuning in. The heyday of the cowboys in the Wild West was this 30-year period from about 1865 to 1895. Now, as you might imagine, lemonade has been around for quite a long time, but I learned kind of recently that carbonated drinks and root beer in particular were already around in the late 1800s. So, I'm not here to say that it would have been common, but it seems possible that if I stepped back into the cowboy days of the late 1800s and found just the right saloon, I may very well have been able to order a glass of lemonade with just a touch of root beer. And then I would be fulfilling that long-standing trope of the character walking into the bar and ordering just a weird enough thing to get people to laugh or roll their eyes. You know, like MacGyver going and getting some milk, or Worf ordering prune juice. I'd have added to it. I'd have played my part. But seriously, this is a really good mix. Just a bit of root beer goes a long way. Yeah. Yeah. Don't knock it till you try it. This looks like apple cider. So good though. Okay. I have a favorite character in Dice Throne, and that character is the Gunslinger. It would be unfair for me to say that the Gunslinger has been decried or ridiculed by the community at large. A lot of people love the Gunslinger, but at the same time, there are a number of criticisms about her abilities, her status effects, and her playstyle, which are somewhat widely agreed upon, and which tend to keep her esteemed below tournament-worthy competitiveness. And this, in turn, has left the Gunslinger decried and ridiculed by the community at large. Well, good thing I've never played in an official tournament. I have the luxury of not having to know what it is I'm talking about. But, case in point, I don't feel the sting of die-dependent frustration that a number of players cite with this character. I can articulate what the criticisms are, I think, but for whatever reason, I don't tend to agree with them. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. What is the Gunslinger criticized for? Well, in a word, bad luck. In 1,000 words or less, the Gunslinger is said to have below average attack values, which is entirely correct. And these below average attack values are vitamin D fortified by a status effect which the Gunslinger gains on every turn, the reload token. The reload token asks the player to roll a die and add half of the value rounded up as damage to the Gunslinger's attack. If she's lucky and rolls a 5 or 6, she might hit like a decently statted character. Still not as strong as, say, the Artificer, but at least you felt the thrill of rolling a +3 attack modifier, you know? And if she rolls a 1 or a 2, then her attack is just plain going to be below average. But wait, there's more bad luck. The Gunslinger has a small straight with more hoops than a basketball court. Actually, exactly the same number of hoops as a basketball court, but it's weird that there's 2 of them. First, she has to activate her small straight, and then she still has to have a showdown roll with her opponent to see if she has to hit for just average damage, or if she gets to hit for even less than average damage. But why stop there, right? The Gunslinger has a defensive ability with the same showdown mechanic. You and your opponent both roll a single die, and if you roll higher, then you get 2 seriously cool options to pick from. But if you only tie or you roll less, then you have to settle for a single point of damage returned. And then, the Gunslinger has a number of ways to gain evasive, which can be a really strong damage mitigation option if you can manage to roll the 1/3 chance of a 1 or a 2 on a single die. But if you miss on the 2/3 chance of a 3, 4, 5, or 6, well, no damage mitigation. There's no doubt about the thematic home run of your Gunslinger having a whole bunch of quick draw duels and sharpshooting single die rolls decide the fate of your game. Playing as the Gunslinger feels like stepping out into the Wild West with a couple of 6-shooters and relying on your courage and quick reflexes. But the problem is that, unlike the heroes of the West, you don't get to practice your aim and build successful rolls into your muscle memory. If you did, then a fair-minded player would have to call you a cheater. No, instead, you're playing against probability, and the numbers aren't pretty. Or so the argument goes. Now, I don't have to keep adding fuel to the fire, but we can't have a good Western if we don't paint a bleak picture for our hero first. So, you see, unlike a number of heroes out there like the Shadow Thief, or the Artificer, or the Tactician, or the Paladin, or the Pirate, or Storm, or take your pick, the Gunslinger doesn't seem to have a specific board state that she's building to. She doesn't get to a particular goal. She's a tumbleweed, tumbly-wheeling her way through the vagaries of unforgiving battle. I don't have to keep adding fuel to the fire, but the Gunslinger lacks native card draw. This is a weakness shared with quite a large pool of characters, so she's in good company. But the characters who do have card drawing written on their board, they certainly have a fancy exclusive club with a secret password and everything, and the Gunslinger obviously isn't invited to it. I don't quite figure how Wolverine managed to get an invitation, but I suppose he's capable of anything. So, as the argument goes, we have a character with a number of abilities which depend on the success of rolls and showdown rolls. Her attacks are below average and might be brought up to slightly above average with good luck, but only rarely brought up to the level of the truly aggressive heroes of the game. She doesn't have a specific goal in the long game, and she lacks access to any card draw beyond the standard actions in each player's deck. If I have persuaded you that the Gunslinger is a poor character, then I suppose I have shot myself in the foot before my argument has even gotten off the ground. But, more importantly, I hope to have done a proper job of articulating how she is usually perceived in discussions of tournament meta relevance. That will be necessary moving forward, because if we agree on what the criticisms are all about, then we can address them very intentionally and specifically. And just maybe, I might be able to make a strong case for the Gunslinger as a competitive Dice Throne character. Eventually, I hope to have addressed every single criticism heretofore listed, but first, I actually need to start this off by doing the exact opposite of what I just did. I will now paint for you a picture of the Gunslinger from the perspective of an enthusiast like myself. This will allow a lot of the fine points of contention to start to reveal themselves right away. So, here goes. In spite of everything I just said, I believe that the Gunslinger is, first and foremost, a phenomenal damage mitigation character. Her defensive ability, just like that of the Moon Elf, scales in response to the damage being sent by our opponent. If the Gunslinger wins her duel, she gets the opportunity to prevent half of the damage coming in, round it up, and although she could choose instead to deal 3 damage, it is usually a greater swing in the flow of the game to choose to halve the damage. The Gunslinger is also equipped with Evasive, for which we have already thoroughly criticized her, but I see Evasive as a very strong status effect if properly understood. At the very least for now, let it be enough to say that it has a stack limit of 3, and that it offers us the chance, without any guarantee, but the chance, to prevent all damage being sent our way. The Gunslinger's offensive game plan, we have already observed, is below the power curve of many other heroes. But in a game of many turns, an uninspiring offense may simply prove to be a slow and steady offense. The Gunslinger is blessed with a relatively accessible toolkit ability, the Bounty Hunter ability, which deals undefendable damage and then inflicts that very interesting status effect, Bounty. With this undefendable attack, and a phenomenal secondary attack waiting on the large straight upgrade in her deck, the Gunslinger has the means to deny opponents resources from their defensive abilities, or to skirt around further damage or unwanted status effects. And many of those abilities on the Gunslinger's board, which are not undefendable, are otherwise happy to provide you with evasive tokens and respectable average attack values in order to give you the chance to just put out more damage than you are taking in, paired with the damage mitigation piece. Furthermore, the Gunslinger has one of the better CP generating engines in the game. It's built into her bounty status effect, and it allows for the selling of fewer cards than most characters in the game. That's really important. Naturally, that allows for more cards to be kept on hand for further down the line, and the CP generation, of course, allows for those cards to be played reliably. And there is the Gunslinger's X factor. So the Gunslinger, as I shall hope to argue, has one of the very best interactions in the entire game between what is seen on the board and the cards you have in your hand. The result is that the Gunslinger is not actually dependent on good luck, but on the seizing of opportunities. Opportunities provided by your board and leveraged by your hand. You will be happy to let your opponent feel like you've been having a lucky run the entire game, and maybe those are the vibes the Gunslinger gives off. But what it really comes down to is that the Gunslinger gives you consistency, staying power, and strong card plays. In order to demonstrate any of these ideas, I'll need to go into a great deal of detail. So if you don't mind coming along for the ride, I'll start right at one of the Gunslinger's most undervalued components, which is her defensive ability, Duel. Duel reads, you and your attacker each roll 1 die. If your roll is greater, you may choose to either deal 3 damage or prevent half damage, rounded up. If your roll is not greater, deal 1 damage. How do we assess the value of this defensive ability? Well, permit me to start our discussion with a completely different character. The Pyromancer has a fantastic defensive ability called Molten Armor. It allows you to roll 5 dice and deal 1 point of damage for every flame you roll, which is a 50% chance on every die. And then you also gain 1 fire mastery for each die which rolled a 5. We know intuitively that if we are playing against the Pyromancer and we swing with a low damage value, that her defensive ability can leave us feeling like we might have been better off not attacking in the first place. To help us conceptualize the power of the Pyromancer's defense, I want us to imagine ourselves as Dice Throne playtesters. It is our job to see how well a given character's abilities work, so we run a gamut of defendable attacks, and we roll the Pyromancer's defensive ability for every one. For the sake of being thorough, let's imagine we decided to roll for the Pyromancer's defensive ability 1,000 times. We would reasonably expect to see just about every possible result, including some massive successes and some complete duds. And we would expect to see that the cumulative impact of her defensive rolls would attenuate to the average of the possibilities. With 5 dice rolled 1,000 times, and half of those dice, well, half of each die face being a flame, we would expect to see somewhere around 2,500 flame icons for a total damage output of at least, well, on average, 2,500. We would also expect to see about 840 fire mastery tokens gained onto the board. Now, an essay like this couldn't have gotten much further without mentioning the work of Argon Jedit, Amy Falk, Mr. Ben of the Build Phase, Undefendable, Gilbert, a board game strategist, and doubtless many others out there who have all contributed a great deal to helping myself and the Dice Throne community understand the theory behind the game. So, I must now borrow a term which is not my own idea, but which helps greatly in comparing different characters' power levels to one another by quantifying different effects in the game. That term is delta. The most basic unit of game impact in Dice Throne is damage. Damage dealt, damage healed, damage received, or mitigated. In our thought experiment, running 1,000 rolls with the Pyromancer defensive rolls, we expect to see an impact of about 2,500 delta from the damage she deals back to the attacker. 1 delta per damage. The 840 Fire Mastery tokens, those are harder to quantify. On the Pyro's small straight, each Fire Mastery adds 1 damage, but on the large straight, each one adds 2 damage, and on the Pyromancer's combustion ability, each Fire Mastery adds 3 damage, or 4 if you're upgraded, and then the Fire Mastery tokens get discarded, but like what a way to go. In every case, a single Fire Mastery token has to be lost at the start of each of the Pyromancer's turns. I don't know, hopefully it's not too generous and it's not too stingy to grant each Fire Mastery token a delta of 2. By estimation. If we can grant that much, then we expect another 1,680 points or so of delta from the Fire Mastery tokens in our playtest of 1,000 defensive rolls. Let's continue to be generous and just round it up to 1,700 delta. That would bring the total delta for the Pyro's defensive roll up to 4,200, which in somewhat simplified terms is an average of 4.2 delta per defensive roll. Seriously impressive stuff. For comparison, let's go to the Barbarian. His thick-skinned defensive ability grants him 3 dice, and for each heart he rolls, he will heal 2 damage. Hearts appear on 1/3 of the die face on each of the Barbarian's dice. So if we rolled his defensive ability some 1,000 times, we will have rolled 3,000 dice, and we will expect to see the results of those rolls attenuate to the average. Therefore, we will expect to see about 1,000 heart symbols for some 2,000 damage healed. This brings the delta for the Barbarian's defensive roll to 2,000 in our playtest of 1,000 rolls. So, per roll, on average, 2 delta. 2 delta per roll, compared to the Pyromancer's 4.2 delta per roll. Let's consider the Samurai and his stand tall defensive roll. The Samurai rolls 3 dice and deals 1 damage for every katana rolled, which is a half of his die face. He also prevents 1 for every kabuto, and he prevents 2 if he rolls a rising sun. And unfortunately, if he doesn't roll any like kabutos or rising suns, if all he rolls are katanas, then he inflicts shame on himself, which gives him a loss of 1 damage the next time he's going to attack. The math on the Samurai's defensive roll is tricky. There are 216 possible combinations of 3 6-sided dice rolled, and they yield different results based on their specific combinations. If we pick up the dice, roll them 1,000 times, we should expect to see about 1,500 katanas for a total of 1,500 damage. We should also expect to see about 1,000 kabutos for a prevention of 1,000 damage. We should also expect to see 500 rising suns, which would be a further prevention of 1,000 damage. But on each roll of the 3 dice together, there's a 9 out of 108 chance of rolling a redundant rising sun, and a 1 out of 216 chance of rolling 2 redundant rising suns. So about 88 of our rising suns will be redundant, which takes away about 176 points of potential damage prevention. And then on an eighth of our defensive rolls, we will expect to inflict shame on ourselves for a further loss of 125 damage. So 1,500 damage dealt, plus 1,000 prevented, plus 1,000 prevented, minus about 175, minus about 125. That gets you a net gain of about 3,200 delta. So the Samurai's defense will give him about 3 delta per attempt on average. In the case of all 3 of these characters, the delta for the defensive roll will be entirely independent of the attack value being sent our way. Up to this point, we haven't yet needed to ask how much attack are we defending against? How much is coming at us? But let's start to explore that question by going to the Shadow Thief. The Shadow Thief actually has 2 defensive abilities. We'll be starting by taking a look at the one that gives us the option to block all incoming damage, and that's his Shadow Defense. With the Shadow Defense, we roll 4 dice. On 2 daggers, we inflict a poison, and daggers are on a third of our die face. On 1 shadow, we can gain the sneak attack status effect, and on 2 shadows, we immediately gain the shadow's status effect, which prevents all incoming damage right away. With all 3 of these possibilities, how do we quantify the resulting status effect? Poison is a persistent status effect which deals 1 point of damage to our opponent on each of their turns. Let's once more err on the side of generosity and call each poison token a delta of 3. Maybe that's not generous enough, I don't know, but after all, our opponent will be much more keen to save their upgrade removal to deal with shadows than they will be to deal with poison, so they have some good staying power. There are 528 out of 1,296 possible rolls of 4 dice, 6-sided, which would inflict poison by getting the 2 daggers. So we can expect to inflict poison about 408 times or so in the playtest of 1,000 rolls for about, estimating 3 delta per poison, 1,200 delta. On 4 dice, we have about a 52% chance of rolling at least 1 6, which means we will expect to gain sneak attack on about 520 of our defense rolls. This gets a little tricky because there is a stack limit of 1, and the Shadow Thief will often spend the early game using his offensive roll phase just to generate resources rather than sending an actual attack. And that leaves the sneak attack unspent on his board. There's nothing for it to be added to. In that case, that can make this part of his defensive ability feel redundant. However, let's consider the delta for these defensive powers in a kind of statistical vacuum. On 520 theoretical rolls of the die for a spent sneak attack, the average damage added may reasonably attenuate to an average of 3.5 damage per token, giving us an attack modifier total of about 1,820 as a result of our playtest of 1,000 rolls. This brings our defensive delta to a little over 3,000. And now we consider the shadow status effect. On 4 dice, we have 171 out of 1,296 possible roll outcomes, which will give us at least 2 shadows. That is shadow face 6-sided dice, and gain for us the shadow status effect. That's about a 13.2% chance of gaining shadows on our defense and just preventing all damage. Across 1,000 defensive roll attempts then, we would expect to gain shadows about 132 times. Here we run into a statistical challenge. To quantify the delta value of gaining the shadow status effect during our opponent's attack, into something concrete, that would require us to know how much damage we were preventing, how much damage our opponent was attacking us with. I don't have the breadth of knowledge nor the intuition to create a statistical model for what our average attack should be in Dice Throne. And here, I could lean once again on the game theory of those who have loved this game well and hold to the idea that the average attack value for a defendable attack is about 7. For now then, let's imagine that we have created a gamut of 1,000 defendable attacks at varying power levels, ranging from the most basic attacks to the most jaw-dropping large straights in the game, but attenuating to that proposed average of 7 damage per attack, and creating a total of 7,000 attack total being thrown at our characters. In the Shadow Thief's case then, we will expect to see a Shadow defense gain the Shadow status effect and block all damage on about 13.2% of the rolls for his defense, or on average 132 times. This represents an expected delta of 924 damage prevented. That is 132 times 7. So then, in our playtest of 1,000 rolls, we expect the Shadow Thief's Shadow defense to generate, let's say, 1,200 delta in poison tokens, 1,800 delta in sneak attack tokens. Anyways, that's a bit of an overestimate situationally, but we're going to give it to him. And he's going to generate about 1,000 delta in damage prevented through the gaining of the Shadow status effect in an instant. This brings the Shadow Thief's delta to about 4,000, or about 4 per roll on average. This puts him right on par with the Pyromancer. Hey, cool. But I've got another problem. Saying that the Shadow defense's delta is an average of 4 per roll sounds impressive enough, but did you notice that's mostly on the strength of the inflicted poisons and the sneak attacks? The delta from the damage mitigation, according to our calculations, was less than 1,000. It was 1 per roll, less than 1, in fact. And I know enough to know that the chance of gaining the Shadow's token is the main reason that the Shadow defense is chosen as the Shadow Thief's main defense. But since that's the case, there must be something terribly wrong with my calculation of the Shadow Thief's damage mitigation being just about 1 delta per defensive roll. Yeah, averaged across the game, averaged across our gamut of defendable attacks. But to put the problem front and center, let's compare the Shadow defense's calculated delta with the other defensive ability on the Shadow Thief's board. After all, it isn't every day that you get to choose between 2 different defenses. The Counter-Strike defense rolls 5 dice, deals 1 damage straight up for each dagger rolled, and inflicts poison on a dagger and a shadow. If we pick up 5 dice and roll them 1,000 times, we should expect to see 1,700 daggers for a damage total of, about 1,700. When we roll 5 dice, there are 7,776 possible outcomes, and 3,870 of them can give us at least 1 dagger and at least 1 shadow, which is about a 49.8% probability. So, in the playtest of 1,000 rolls, we can expect to inflict poison about 500 times. If we hold to the idea that poison is worth about 3 delta, then we gain a delta total of about 1,500 from inflicting poisons, with 1,700 damage from our daggers and 1,500 delta from inflicting poisons. This gives us a total delta of about 3,200 with an average of about 3.2 delta per defensive roll. Comparing the Shadow defense to the Counter-Strike ability then, we see at first glance that even without a successful gaining of the Shadow status effect, the first defense has at least as much delta to suggest it as the second defense does. So then why wouldn't you always roll for shadow defense and maybe get lucky on the 13% chance that you'll block all damage? Well, if you wait for just a second there, we have evaluated the shadow defense in a kind of statistical vacuum, and when we did, it was the possibility of gaining sneak attack which provided us our greatest amount of delta, 1.8 on average, over so many test rolls. But since the Shadow Thief has that rare ability to choose between defenses, we also need to imagine the in-game scenarios where we can look right at our board and see very clearly that we already have our sneak attack. In these scenarios, we will know ahead of time that sneak attack will only be redundant and that it can't gain any delta for us. In those situations, the average delta for the shadow defense drops almost by half, from 4 to a little over 2. About 1.2 delta for the probability of inflicting poison, and then a little less than 1 delta for the probability of preventing all damage. And therefore, in such situations, the counter-strike is clearly the better option. 3 delta compared to just 2. Or maybe we're undervaluing poison as a status effect, and its delta should be higher? But if so, the comparison only becomes more problematic. The counter-strike attack has a higher probability of inflicting poison. The average for counter-strike would only increase in delta, in its advantage over the other defense. Well, what's the point then? Am I arguing that we should be using counter-strike on the Shadow Thief more often than we might otherwise be inclined? Well, actually, as a bit of a side quest discussion, maybe that isn't a bad idea. Perhaps it would make sense for a seasoned Shadow Thief player to be keenly aware of situations where 2 things are true. Firstly, that they already have sneak attack waiting on their board, and secondly, that they are being attacked with a low damage value. Because low damage values certainly do exist, and some attacks pour a lot of their value into tokens and effects. So if we know a sneak attack would only be redundant anyways, and we suspect that the delta gained from the poison and direct damage would be worth foregoing the 13.2% probability of dodging an acceptable attack, then perhaps Counter-Strike is worth a second look. After all, why have 2 defensive abilities if you don't figure on using them both? But much more to the point at hand, the comparable statistical value of Counter-Strike would seem to suggest that shadow defense isn't quite as good as it is thought to be. The average delta of 1 from the possibility of gaining shadows paints a much more subdued picture than we are used to considering. So either our perception of the shadow defense is off the mark, or else there's something problematic with the statistical model I have been using up to this point in the discussion. So hold on to that thought, or rather, allow me to make the same exact argument from the perspective of another character. If we were to make a list of the strongest defensive characters in the game, certainly the Moon Elf would have to be included. And this is not owed to any single aspect of her board on its individual merit, but it is true that the community opinion of the Moon Elf's defensive ability, Missed Me, is quite favorable. Specifically, I could quote at least 3 sources, including the analysis provided by Argonjedit on Reddit, which specifically say that the defensive ability on the Moon Elf is probably, or simply is, the main reason that people choose to play the Moon Elf. Obviously, that's really high praise for a defensive ability. Therefore, Missed Me must be a very good defensive ability. And I don't reference anyone here to contradict them. I'm really glad to lean on the expertise of others to help articulate our understanding of the game. So please bear with me for a moment, because it's going to seem like I'm being contentious, but it's actually the opposite. Hold on to that idea that Missed Me is such a good defensive ability that it is essentially the main reason for playing as a Moon Elf. Okay, taking that under advisement. Now then, let us quantifiably assess the Moon Elf's defensive ability. Missed Me, From the lens of statistical probability, the Moon Elf rolls 5 dice on her ability and can prevent half of the incoming damage of an attack rounded up if she rolls at least 2 feet. There are some 4,192 possible ways, I think, I really think, to roll at least 2 feet on 5 dice out of 7,776 possible rolls of 5 dice for about a 54% probability of success. And this means that on 1,000 rolls of the Moon Elf's defensive ability, we will expect to see about 540 of those successfully prevent half of all incoming damage rounded up. If we assume an average attack of 7, then the Moon Elf will prevent, on average, 4 damage on 540 attacks for a total damage prevention of about 2,160 damage. Over 1,000 defense rolls, this represents a little over 2 delta per roll devoted to damage mitigation. But that's not even the full story. The Moon Elf can also deal damage back at the same time. 1 damage for every 2 arrows. On 5 dice, there is a combined 5/8 chance of rolling exactly 2 or 3 arrows and dealing 1 damage. And there is a combined 3/16 chance of rolling exactly 4 or 5 arrows and dealing 2 damage. In 1,000 defensive rolls, we should expect to see 1 damage on 625 of the rolls for a damage total of 625, and we should expect to deal 2 damage on about 188 of the rolls for a damage total of 376. These numbers combine for almost exactly 1,000 points of damage, giving us an average of near exactly 1 delta per defensive roll, from the damage piece of it. So then, the average delta on the Moon Elf's defensive ability comes to a total of 3.2 per roll. 2.2 on average from damage mitigation, and very precisely 1 on average from dealing damage back. But earlier, we discussed that the Samurai has an average delta of 3 on his defensive roll. And that either means that the Samurai's defense is as good as the Moon Elf's, or that the Moon Elf's defense is as bad as the Samurai's. Take your pick. I don't feel like anyone out there says that the Samurai's defense is the reason you choose him. As we can see from our statistical analysis of both the Shadow Thief and the Moon Elf in their defensive abilities, there is something weird going on. Could it be that 7 isn't the right number to suggest for an average defendable attack? Maybe average defendable attack should be considered higher, and that would boost our average delta from the damage prevention pieces of these abilities? Well, yes, it would. It would boost the average delta. But I'm not convinced that 7 is the wrong number. And anyways, you would have to start boosting that average number by quite a bit to start making anything like an impressive dent in delta. For example, by how much hypothetical damage would we need to increase the average attack value in order to increase the Moon Elf's defensive ability from an average delta of 3.2 to an average delta of 4.2? If we increase the average attack value to 9 defendable damage, then the Moon Elf's average delta after 1,000 defensive rolls would likely be about 3.7. And we wouldn't get any further delta with an average of 10 defendable damage because that wouldn't increase the damage prevented because the Moon Elf rounds up anyways. We would have to go all the way to an average attack of 11 defendable damage, at which point we could reasonably expect that the Moon Elf will have rolled an average of 4.2 delta with her defensive ability, which now is actually right where we started our discussion with the delta value of the Pyromancer's defense. Is the average defendable value actually as high as 11? I don't suspect it is. I don't think 7 is a bad estimation. I think that's a good guideline. And again, that's not my guideline. That's the work of many in the community and sort of the consensus that people have come to. It feels like the right number. But that brings our delta values right back down to what we were talking about earlier. Well, on the other hand, are the Moon Elf and the Shadow Thief maybe worse at defense than our experiences have suggested to us? No, I don't think that they are. Something has got to give then. What is it that we are missing between what we suspect to be true and what the statistical model is telling us? I'll hazard an answer if you'll bear with me. What we're missing is variability. We very much need to consider variability in attack values in order to get a picture of the significance of scalable damage mitigation. You see, the playtest of 1,000 rolls is this wonderful picture of the tyranny of the majority. It will start to give you the impression that because the average attack value is probably 7 damage, that blocking 7 damage from time to time is all that the Shadows token is good for. And in statistical analysis, this is somewhat to be expected. We learn to accommodate for outlier data points and find broad trends. But in games of Dice Throne, as a player, with a great deal of control over what happens on each turn, you make it your aim to do the exact opposite. It is a core strategy of every character's game plan to look for outlier data and create outlier data and take advantage of outlier data. Let's go back to the samurai now to put this into perspective. There is no outcome on his defensive roll which can possibly grant you less than 2 delta. And there is no outcome on his defensive roll which can possibly grant you more than 4 delta. Here we go. He will always either deal 3 damage and then self-inflict shame, or he will deal 2 and prevent 1, or he will deal 2 and prevent 2, or deal 1 and prevent 2, or deal 1 and prevent 3, or deal 0 and prevent 2, or deal 0 and prevent 3, or deal 0 and prevent 4. This is not actually a bad defense. An average delta of 3 on an ability which doesn't scale with our opponent's attack is really respectable. But even in the sad case where we roll 3 katanas and inflict shame on our own board, there's rarely a reason for us to modify our dice, much less for our opponent to do so. But when we look at the Moon Elf, who shares nearly the same average delta value, again, the Samurai had 3, the Moon Elf has 3.2, we see that her defensive ability provides a low floor. She could end up rolling like a lot of 6s and maybe like 1 arrow and not do anything back. But she also gives you this really high ceiling. Again, it's possible for the Moon Elf to block nothing and deal nothing back and give you a delta of 0, but it is also possible for the Moon Elf to prevent 8 damage on an incoming attack of 15, and then add in a point of damage of her own for good measure for a total delta of 9 on a single turn from a defense. Now, the statistical argument would immediately rebuff the significance of that kind of event by reminding us of the obvious truth. Our opponent will not always be attacking us for 15, and we will not always succeed on our defensive roll. But as true as these observations are, they miss the point. We don't need our opponent always to be attacking for 15, and we don't need to always succeed in our defensive roll. What matters is that when our opponent attacks with massive damage and when we succeed in mitigating that damage, we create an outsized impact on the state of the game. If the barbarian is attacking us with his large straight ability and you happen to pick up the dice and you happen to roll 2 feet on your defense, then you have scored a major advantage, and it will have ramifications both for your strategy and the barbarian strategy for the rest of the game moving forward. Naturally, this is an important concept when speaking about the Shadow Thief too. If the Moon Elf's damage mitigation ceiling is high on her defensive ability, the Shadow Thief doesn't even have a roof over his head. And remember, the probability of rolling a natural pair of 6s on 4 dice is actually rather low, like 13.2%. But the strength of the ability doesn't lie in its likelihood. The strength lies in its potential. When it succeeds, it creates an outsized impact on the game, and especially when it succeeds against a high-value attack. Now, naturally, that argument holds true even when we have no cards in hand. In fact, a naturally occurring successful roll for damage mitigation creates the greatest impact on the game because it didn't require us to invest any resources. We still have those resources available for later. But since there is such great value in the potential for an ability to mitigate damage without requirement of spending resources, then certainly we can also now talk about dice manipulation. Once again, we may say that the strength of a defensive ability, like Mist Me for the Moon Elf, or Shadow Defense for the Shadow Thief, lies in its potential to block outsized amount of damage. But now, what we mean is that if the ability to block damage is on our board, then it also has the particular value of being something that we can leverage with the support of the cards in our hand. As a matter of fact, we get to have the best of both worlds. Because of the order of operations in the game, we can first pick up the dice and hope for an awesome roll, and if we're fortunate enough to get one, then we have gained considerable advantage. But if we fail, we still have time after the fact to go ahead and invest those resources after all, if we decide that the amount of damage we would prevent is worth the cost of the resources that we spend. What sorts of resources? The Moon Elf and the Shadow Thief can use samesies to turn one of the right dice into two of the right dice. The Moon Elf and the Shadow Thief can use Better D to save half of a successful roll, or just to try it all over again. The Moon Elf and the Shadow Thief can use Twice as Wild to just give themselves the dice that they need. In the right situations, the Moon Elf and the Shadow Thief can use Tippet to access what they need. In summary, the Moon Elf and the Shadow Thief both have defenses whose value scales in response to the amount of damage being sent from their opponent's character, and although the probabilities of our rolls would suggest the sort of damage we should expect to block on average in each game, we must still consider that the sheer amount of damage mitigated in individual instances of successful rolls will have a significant impact on the state of the game, particularly as and when the damage mitigated scales in response to unusually high attacks by our opponent. This argument might be enough on its own to explain the value of these defenses, but it doesn't have to be made on its own. For if we find that we need the Moon Elf or the Shadow Thief to come through on their defense in a given situation, and then we see that they have failed, we may still have the opportunity to use the cards in our hand to take another chance, or simply to create the successful roll we are looking for. Whew! Now then, if perhaps we are on the same page about all of this, then I have already made my argument for the Gunslinger's defensive ability in full. The Gunslinger's damage mitigation mirrors that of the Moon Elf. If her defense is successful, she has the opportunity to prevent half of the incoming damage rounded up. Therefore, just like the Moon Elf, the Gunslinger has the potential on her defensive ability to create outsized impact in the natural flow of the game, creating strategic ripples for the rest of the match. And the Gunslinger has just as much reason to consider dice manipulation in order to leverage her defense as does the Moon Elf. Now, it is true that the Shadow Thief literally has twice as much reason to consider dice manipulation because he prevents twice as much damage on a successful roll, but at least in that regard, the Moon Elf and the Gunslinger are on equal footing. The Gunslinger can use Tippet to win ties, the Gunslinger can use Better D to reroll for duels where she lost to a low ball roll, and the Gunslinger has a particular advantage with her defensive ability in that she can generally focus her attention on just one particular die. She can use Six-It to claim a duel, The Gunslinger can even use try again to reroll her side of the duel 2 times over. Now, I have to beat the critics to their criticism right here before we go any further. Firstly, damage mitigation is only one piece of these defensive abilities. The Moon Elf will generally deal a point of damage back, often at the same time that she succeeds in having the damage. And the Shadow Thief, while having steeper odds of damage mitigation, has really good odds of generating damage. Meanwhile, the Gunslinger generally will only deal a point of damage back if she loses her duel. You can choose to deal 3 damage back if you win your duel, and 3 damage is nice, but in that case, you are choosing to forego the high ceiling damage mitigation that we need from her ability. These criticisms are entirely true, but the Moon Elf's damage dealing is still quite small and only a minor piece of her defensive abilities puzzle. It's not the most interesting piece of that puzzle. Again, when the Barbarian's attacking us for 15 and we're getting a 9 delta swing because we dealt the damage back and we prevented half of the Barbarian's attack, 1 of that 9 delta was the Elf shooting back. 8 of that 9 delta was the Moon Elf preventing the damage. The little bit of damage back is important, it's great. It's not the most interesting piece of the puzzle. It's not what creates the outsized impact on the game. Now, by contrast, the Shadow Thief's ability is quite interested in gaining ways to add up damage. That damage generation is of considerable importance to his defensive ability. But if we do not begrudge that advantage to the Shadow Thief in comparison to the Moon Elf, and we still say that the Moon Elf's defensive ability is the main reason to play, then I don't know why we need to begrudge the Shadow Thief's advantage in comparison with the Gunslinger. The Moon Elf and the Gunslinger are both trying to do the same thing. And that offensive potential on the Shadow Thief is at least a bit counteracted by the lower odds of mitigating damage. But if it is true that the Shadow Thief has lower odds of mitigating damage, then fans of the Shadow Thief will be wise to point out here that his access to dice manipulation is so much more impressive than the Gunslinger's. My response is, once again, to concede the point. But the Gunslinger, as we will discuss later, has one of the better engines for generating CP in the game, which translates to greater access to dice manipulation than many other characters in the game, including the Moon Elf, about whose defensive ability we have already expressed the enthusiasm of the Dice Throne community at large. If anyone is to argue that the Gunslinger's dice manipulation is irrelevant to her defensive ability, then they must contend with the utter lack of both card drawing and CP generation on the Moon Elf's board. On the other hand, fans of the Moon Elf would be wise to point out here that her defensive ability, which seeks to create the exact same damage mitigation as the Gunslinger's, has a greater probability of succeeding, 54% compared to 41%. Once again, I concede that point. In fact, since it is true that the Gunslinger and the Moon Elf both are trying to prevent half damage rounded up, and since it is also true that the Moon Elf has a higher probability of doing so, and it is also true that the Moon Elf can accomplish damage output while mitigating damage, then strictly speaking, the Moon Elf's defensive ability is simply better than the Gunslinger's. Now, do hold on a moment. Remember again, I'm a huge fan of the Gunslinger's. I wouldn't have spent all this time arguing for the value of the Gunslinger's defensive ability if the grand conclusion here was that her defensive ability was poor and unreliable. And you see, that's the fallacy we have to contend with here. Equating second place with low value. Yes, the Gunslinger's defensive ability is very easy to compare with the Moon Elf's, and the comparison proves quite clearly that the Moon Elf's defense is better. But I don't have to be embarrassed by that. And why in the world not? Because what matters here is that the Gunslinger's defense lives in the same world of game warping potential as the Moon Elves. Both characters are better off for having that potential. And since we are, by and large, enthusiastic about the high ceiling of the Moon Elf's defensive ability, I just don't think that the Gunslinger's lower probability is low enough that we should instead be focused on the low floor of her defensive ability. The Moon Elf has that same low floor. We're just comparing 54% probability of success with 41% probability of success. We'd rather have the 54%, but since preventing half damage is so awesome, having that 41%, if we can have it, we're going to take it. To prove the point, if we want to talk about raw statistics, then let us remember that the Gunslinger will prevent more damage on average in the playtest of 1,000 rolls than the Shadow Thief will. You see, the Gunslinger will succeed on about 41% of 1,000 hypothetical duels, having, let's say, 7 defendable damage, and thereby preventing 4 damage on some 410 defensive rolls for a total damage mitigation of about 1,600 compared to the Shadow Thief's 924. Now, of course, that's not a fair comparison. Indeed, I will seem to have contradicted myself, since I have made the case earlier against painting a purely statistical picture of these abilities. But there we go. That's exactly what I'm getting at. In comparing all 3 of these characters with one another, we must remember that the playtest of 1,000 rolls does not account for the power of outlier data. The Shadow Thief has no reason to be embarrassed by some statistical model suggesting that he somehow ought to be mitigating less damage than the Gunslinger, but by the same token, the Gunslinger has no reason to be embarrassed by that same statistical model showing that she ought to be mitigating less damage than the Moon Elf. To bring this portion of the argument to a close, we might say with a great deal of frustration that the Gunslinger has lower odds of succeeding than the Moon Elf and weaker access to resource generation than the Shadow Thief. But if we are frustrated with the sense that the Gunslinger lives in the worst of both worlds, then we must also accept the reality of the converse. Specifically, that the Gunslinger has greater odds of succeeding than the Shadow Thief and greater access to resource generation than the Moon Elf. Whatever way we treat any of these 3 characters, we must apply the same reasoning to the others, while still recognizing their strengths and weaknesses. In short, the Shadow Thief and the Moon Elf have both proven the outsized significance of damage mitigation, which scales in response to the value of our opponent's attack. Therefore, I believe it to be logically consistent to acknowledge the outsized significance of the Gunslinger's damage mitigation, which scales in response to the value of our opponent's attacks. The result is, quite simply, that the Gunslinger's defense is a powerful ability, and it must be considered a key part of your strategy as a Gunslinger player. But if I may say so, you will only get that value out of the Gunslinger's defensive ability if you are looking for opportunities to use it to its fullest. And I'm not just talking about trusting that you have a real chance to win your games. Of course, that's important too. If you don't think the Gunslinger stands a chance, then you won't play with an eye for optimization. But no, beyond that, there's also a specific temptation with the Gunslinger's ability to massively undervalue the damage mitigation of a successful duel and instead choose the option to deal 3 damage back. Imagine a scenario, for example, in which we win a duel on our defensive roll, and then we spend an evasive token, succeed, and avoid all damage. Clearly now, the best choice with our defensive ability would be to deal 3 damage back, correct? I couldn't possibly say that's wrong, could I? Of what possible value would it serve to choose to prevent half damage on an attack from which we are already blocking all damage? But the problem here was spending an evasive token in the first place. If you've succeeded on your defensive ability, you have the good fortune of being able to block half of your opponent's incoming damage without spending any resources at all. Now you get to optimize your resources by saving your evasive token for another attack later down the road when you have failed a duel or when your opponent is swinging with undefendable damage. Now, I should never criticize the availability of multiple options on a successful defensive ability if we appreciate the proper situations for choosing each option. Dealing 3 could, in theory, give you lethal damage in the final turn of a game and create a tie out of what would otherwise be defeat. Dealing 3 damage would be a higher delta in the rare situations where opponent is attacking us with 4 or less damage. And dealing 3 damage can be an equal delta value in situations where our opponent is attacking us with like 5 or 6 damage. And in that case, it would be more or less a question of matchup and playstyle. But if we can block 4 or more damage with our duel, then that should usually be the choice we make. I have made the case that this is true even if you have an evasive token on your board. So then, this should be even more clearly true if we don't have any evasives to spend. If you can prevent more damage than you can deal, then your prevention will usually have a greater impact on the game. Not always. Be aware of the situation, but usually. All of this brings us to the second part of our discussion, which is the evasive token.
Do not forsake me, oh my darling.
By current ruling, the evasive token reads, when a player with this token has incoming damage from any source, they may choose to spend it. If spent, roll 1 die. If the outcome is 1 to 2, no damage is received, although other associated effects may still apply. Multiple tokens may be spent in an attempt to prevent the same source of damage. We have already made the argument for the value of the Gunslinger's defensive ability, in that it has high ceiling damage mitigation. For the same reasons, the evasive token is a high value status effect whose value is tied to its very high ceiling damage mitigation. As it stands, however, the evasive token faces a lot of criticism. Or perhaps it faces one central critique, and that critique leads to a number of very valid points, differing in focus, but all leading back to the central issue. What is the central issue? Quite simply, the evasive token must be spent, and when spent, it has only a 1/3 probability of success. Fair enough. What problems can that create for us as a player? First, 33% just feels a little low. We wish we had better odds. I'll be glad to address that in a moment. Second, the variable nature of the token can seem to create a gap in information for us as a player. I'll be very, very glad to address that in a moment. Alright then, let me address the issue of probability on the evasive token. An individual evasive token has only a 1/3 probability of success. However, evasives have a stack limit of 3, and sometimes they do stack up to 3. And if you're a player who loves what evasive can offer, you can chase, making them stack up to 3. For this reason, we can start talking about averages again. An individual evasive has only a 1/3 probability of succeeding, but we can put that another way. On average, evasive will succeed 1/3 of the time. Now, that doesn't quite mean what we might think. Does that mean that if you spend 3 evasives, you should expect one of them to succeed? Actually, literally, no. Because the probability of a successful evasive roll on 3 attempts is equal to 100% minus the probability of failing all 3 rolls. And the probability of failing all three rolls is 2/3 times 2/3 times 2/3, which is 8 out of 27. That is to say, the chance of succeeding on an evasive in one of three attempts is about 19 out of 27, which is a little bit above a 2/3 probability of success. That's nice. It's still not a guarantee. Okay, so what is my point? Well, 2 points. First off, as we can see, if we generate our stack limit of evasives, we can double our odds of successfully avoiding all damage when it's time to try. We have some control over the probability, and it's encouraging to see the numbers climb. But more fundamentally, the second point is simply that when we assess the value of the evasive token, we can be tempted to focus on the value of the individual token, when we should focus on the value of all of them taken together. An individual token has only a 1/3 chance of success, that is low, but if we focus instead on the cumulative value of the evasive token, we can understand the value in seeing one of them succeed. And whenever we talk about probabilities in Dice Throne, we should remember that we have cards in our hand. Evasives can be another wonderful use of your dice manipulation cards. Typically, we think of disruption as a matter of playing so wild to knock the opponent off of their mini ult and then cause a whiff. But you can get much the same effect from using your so wild on a failed evasive roll. Both uses will block massive damage from coming your way. Well then, why not just manipulate our opponent's attack and be done with it? Always a great option, of course. You will probably also spare yourself from seeing unwanted status effects hit the table. But if you know that you can hedge your bets on your roll with an evasive, then what evasive is actually giving you is a free opportunity to roll and see if you can save your so wild for later down the road, maybe for yourself. It is always best, of course, when evasive simply happens on its own. When it does, then it obviously makes a huge impact on the game. But I think we make a logical mistake if we assume something like the converse and then draw an overarching conclusion from there. The temptation may be to say, successful evasives make a huge impact on the game in the gunslinger's favor, and therefore, unsuccessful evasives make a huge impact on the game in the opponent's favor. Therefore, the gunslinger requires their success in order to have a successful game. There, the gunslinger has a 1/3 chance of having a successful game. Right? Like, bring out the gunslinger, shuffle your deck, roll a die, see if you get a 1 or a 2, and if you don't, just go ahead and shake your opponent's hand. But come on now, that's not how it works. We've taken an advantage that the gunslinger has. An advantage. This bonkers ability to, maybe not, evade all of our opponent's damage on an attack. And then we've decided to see it as a weakness, maybe even as a liability. But the truth is, most characters don't have that luxury. Now then, our second issue with the evasive token was that its variable nature may seem to create a gap in information for us as a player. We can't know ahead of time whether it will succeed or not. I will argue that this apparent lack of information is actually a weaponized disadvantage which hurts our opponent much more than us. Here's what I mean. By and large, you guide your game as a player on your own turn. That's when you are in the driver's seat. On your own turn, you put the damage in and you choose how to build up resources for your character. Evasive is rolled on your opponent's turn. And yes, absolutely, a failed evasive roll will be the difference between taking 8, 10, 15 damage and taking none. But that unpredictability happens while your opponent is in the driver's seat. A game like Dice Throne is very much about information. Before I roll for my evasive, I have a question mark on my board. Will I fail or will I succeed? But let's imagine the worst case scenario. I fail my roll. Well then, my failed evasive will fail to prevent damage, maybe even massive damage, but now I have my answer. And my turn is about to come up. I have the information I need to drive my turn the direction it needs to go. But the presence of an evasive on my board before I roll it, that robs my opponent of information while they are steering their offensive roll phase. My opponent must ask his or herself, do I swing for massive damage and risk a successful evasive? Do I need to spend CP and valuable removal just to get rid of all doubt? Should I accept that it's going to be rolled for? And should I just work towards a more conservative attack with better resource generation? Will I feel cheated if I lowball my attack and then the evasive whiffs? Is my attack worth spending dice manipulation on if I might just get stuffed? For these reasons, I believe that the biggest swing factor from evasive is not for me, as the gunslinger, if I fail. That's my opponent's turn. I expect under normal circumstances to be taking damage during my opponent's turn. The biggest swing factor on evasive is for my opponent if I succeed. That interrupts the natural flow of the game, and it does so in my favor. Furthermore, because evasive is rolled on my opponent's turn, I have an entire security system set in place before I even have to break the glass and pull the alarm. Let me see my defensive roll first, if that's applicable. If I win the duel, awesome. Let me just have the damage and save my evasive for another turn. Or maybe my opponent is going all out. Okay, I'm in danger, but the bigger attacks are also the more vulnerable attacks. I have a greater opportunity now to force a whiff with the dice manipulation cards in my hand. Let me go there first. In summary then, while it is true that evasive is not a guaranteed roll, I don't think its failure breaks the gunslinger's game. It is on the board of a character with a high value defensive ability and strong CP generation. It is targetable with dice manipulation. It succeeds or fails before you take your own turn and have to make decisions as the player. And it can stack for multiple attempts, increasing the probability of an eventual successful roll just by the weight of repetition.
Coming home, sweetheart darling, just my rifle, pony, and me.
Now, we have argued for the high value of the gunslinger's defensive ability, and we have argued that the evasive token is much more consistent and advantageous than it first appears. These are both powerful methods of damage mitigation available to the gunslinger, but we don't have to leave the discussion there. The gunslinger has a third method of damage mitigation, which is to use her dice manipulation cards to force a whiff on our opponent's offensive roll phase. Now yes, it is true that every character has access to the same basic toolkit of dice manipulation cards. So this method of damage prevention may seem to be too universal to be worth discussing. But if you will bear with me for a moment, there are 4 cards in every deck which can reach across the table and change our opponent's outcome. Those cards are Tippet, Helping Hand, So Wild, and Twice as Wild. And while we're on the topic, we can throw in Not This Time, not as dice manipulation, but as pure mitigation. We haven't spoken about the Gunslinger's bounty status effect in detail, but if you are familiar, it allows you to add 1 damage to each of your successful attacks and gain 1 CP. A player who aims for an early bounty status effect can begin generating extra CP every turn. As players of the Gunslinger, it behooves us to be aware of this advantage from the very beginning of the game and make a simple change to our usual playstyle. we want to sell fewer cards. We want to make it a strategic point to hold on to most of our cards and feel good about the fact that we held on to them and that we can afford them. This doesn't mean that we can't ever sell cards, and some cards, even in the Gunslinger's deck, are pretty easy to let go of. But we have the resources to play our cards at times and in situations where many of the other characters would be forced to make tough calls. It goes without saying then that the cards listed above are the ones you want to hold on to unless the situation arises where you can explain to yourself in exact detail why you would need to sell. Twice as Wild will save your game when your opponent is trying to activate an ultimate or a brutal mini-ult. So Wild can cause a whiff on mid-value, mid-difficulty attacks, and Tip It, or Helping Hand, are great for stopping large straights. A critique might arise here. We have mentioned that dice manipulation cards also help us out on our evasives and our defensive ability, so we might fairly wonder whether we're expecting our dice manipulation to cover too many bases at once, especially since a number of our cards will also make good candidates for helping us on our own offensive role phase. To that, I will firstly say that it will always matter what's happening on any given turn, and the proper use for an individual card can vary wildly from game to game. So do be aware of what's going on in the moment. But then I would also suggest that certain groups of cards work best in specific roles, or close to equally well in multiple roles. Our defensive ability, for example, could be greatly helped by Tip It, but you will usually get more bang for your buck if you use Tip It to knock an opponent off of an ability after their third roll. So you probably want to save it for just such a scenario. Meanwhile, our defensive ability has its own card, Better D, to help us win our duels, and it could be helped along by Six It, which is a card that can only affect our dice anyways. Or consider the use of So Wild for evasive. Here, you might get pretty even value whether using it to create a successful evasion or using it to mitigate an offensive roll phase. In fact, there might be rolls on your opponent's turn where So Wild wouldn't even guarantee that your opponent whiffs, in which case saving it for evasive is the clear choice. But on the other hand, evasive can really benefit from the use of Try Again, which allows for one evasive attempt to function as 3. And again, Try Again won't help against your opponent's rolls at all. At the end of the day, there is definite overlap between our dice manipulation cards and all 3 methods of damage mitigation available to us as players of the Gunslinger. And deciding what is the right card to use in which situation must come down to a careful assessment of the situation in front of you. But the Gunslinger excels at damage mitigation because she has no less than 3 pathways available to leverage with her cards, and because she has above average CP generation to pay for the cards necessary to do so. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll tune in to the second part where we will be discussing the Gunslinger's offense. Or rather, I'll be reading you my essay and you can write your own thoughts in the comments section after I've gotten everything off of my chest. Alright, thanks again.